Right, so you know how much we love to geek out on behavioral economics, right?
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Well, today we're doing a deep dive into one of those powerful forces in, like, the entire human experience.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
It's loss aversion,
Yeah.
and it plays a huge role in real estate, more than most people realize.
Loss aversion. So, like, the fear of losing money.
Yeah, that's part of it. But it's bigger than just money. It's about that gut-wrenching feeling we get when we think we're going to miss out on something.
Oh, okay. I feel that FOMO all the time.
We all do.
Wow.
And it's like hardwired into our brains. So for this deep dive, we found this awesome podcast that really gets into the nitty-gritty of how loss aversion affects both buyers and sellers.
Cool. I'm ready to get nerdy about this.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So imagine this. You lose $100.
Uh-huh.
How does that feel?
Oof. Not good. Definitely makes my stomach clench a little.
Now flip it.
Yeah.
You find $100. How does that feel?
Pretty good. But probably not as intense as losing $100.
Exactly. That's loss aversion in action. The pain of a loss hits us way harder than the pleasure of an equal gain.
Makes you wonder why we're all so obsessed with winning, huh?
Right. Like our brains are wired to avoid pain more than they are to seek pleasure. And this podcast points out that even time can feel like a loss during the home buying process.
Time is a loss.
Yeah, like the longer the search, the more you worry about missing the perfect property.
Ooh, yeah, that makes total sense. I've definitely felt that pressure before. It's like the clock is ticking and the opportunities are slipping away.
And that fear of missing out can make people do some crazy things.
Oh, yeah, tell me about it. I've seen buyers jump on a place without really thinking it through just because they were terrified someone else would snag it.
That's why it's so important to understand how this whole loss aversion thing works, both for buyers and for the agents working with them.
So let's break it down. What exactly is loss aversion? Like, where did this idea come from?
Well, this podcast defines loss aversion as a key principle from behavioral economics. It was first studied by those like superstar psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky.
Oh, yeah, those guys. They won a Nobel Prize for their work, right?
I think so, yeah. Their research showed that the pain of losing something, say, that $100 we talked about, is much stronger than the joy of gaining the same amount.
Interesting. So if we connect this to real estate, it means that buyers are more likely to take action to avoid a loss rather than just to score a great deal.
It's not just about hunting for a bargain. It's about dodging the pain of overpaying or missing out.
Okay, so how does this play out in the real world of real estate? What are some of the specific ways loss aversion shows up?
Well, the podcast highlights a few key areas.
Hit me with them.
First, there's the fear of overpaying, which can totally paralyze buyers.
Yeah, I've seen that. They find a home they love, but then they get stuck in this analysis paralysis, afraid to move forward because they're convinced they'll pay too much.
Yeah. It's almost like they're so focused on avoiding that potential loss
Yeah.
that they forget about the big picture of actually finding a place to live.
Totally. They miss out on a great opportunity because they're too busy worrying about getting the absolute best deal.
And then on the flip side, you've got the fear of missing out, FOMO.
That's the one that gets me every time.
It's especially strong in markets with low inventory or in super popular neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah. Those bidding wars are brutal. It's like everyone loses their minds a little bit.
And then you've got the time factor as well.
Huh, the time factor.
Yeah. This podcast points out that time can feel like a loss, as if the longer you search, the more opportunities are just slipping away.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like that pressure of feeling like you're running out of time to find the perfect place.
And that perception of time as a loss can lead buyers to make rush decisions.
Or settle for a property that doesn't really meet their needs.
Exactly. So knowing all of this, how can anyone buying or selling a home use this knowledge of loss aversion to their advantage?
And I mean ethically, of course. We're not talking about manipulating anyone here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's all about understanding how these psychological forces are already at play and then using that knowledge to make smarter, more informed decisions.
Right on. So what does the podcast recommend?
Well, they offer some really interesting strategies. The first one is to gently highlight potential losses, but without being pushy or manipulative.
Okay, so like, how would that work in a real estate context?
So let's say you're an agent working with a buyer who's unsure about a property that's priced fairly, but is in a super competitive area. You might say something like, I just want to make sure we don't miss out on this opportunity. Homes in this area tend to sell quickly. So if it feels right, let's be ready to move forward when you are.
Ah, I see. You're acknowledging the potential for loss without being too aggressive. You're nudging them toward action, but in a way that feels helpful and supportive.
It's like you're subtly triggering that fear of loss without making them feel pressured or cornered.
Exactly. That's a great example. What else?
Another tactic the podcast mentions is using scarcity and urgency. But again, the key is to avoid coming across as like a used car salesman.
Right, right. No one wants to feel like they're being manipulated.
So you might emphasize that there are only a few homes in that price range in the entire neighborhood. Or that if this one isn't the right fit, they may need to act quickly to find something comparable.
Okay, I get it. You're creating a sense of urgency without using scare tactics.
And this next one is a biggie, highlighting the financial benefits of acting now.
Which makes sense, since loss aversion is often tied to that fear of losing money.
Exactly. So you could talk about potential price appreciation, how interest rates are looking, and even the tax benefits of homeownership.
Like, hey, if you wait a few months, prices in this area could jump and you'll end up paying a lot more for a similar property.
Exactly. You're appealing to their desire to avoid that potential financial loss.
Smart. What else?
And maybe most importantly, the podcast emphasizes that addressing the buyer's fears directly can make a huge difference.
So instead of dancing around those fears or like trying to pretend they don't exist, it's better to just acknowledge and validate them.
Exactly. Sometimes simply acknowledging those fears can help build trust and reduce anxiety.
That makes sense. When someone feels heard and understood, it can really help to lower their defenses.
So instead of tiptoeing around the issue, you might say something like, I understand you're concerned about overpaying, and that's a valid concern. That's why I've done a thorough market analysis to make sure this home is priced fairly.
You're validating their concerns and showing that you're on their side, which builds confidence.
Okay, so we've talked about how to use loss aversion effectively. But what about the potential pitfalls? Where can things go wrong?
Oh, there are definitely some. This podcast dedicates a whole segment to this, actually. The first pitfall they highlight is overusing urgency.
Makes sense. If you constantly bombard someone with act now or lose out messaging, it's going to get old fast.
It can create pressure and distrust, which is the opposite of what you want.
And the other danger is focusing too much on the negative, the fear aspect of loss aversion.
Right, because remember, loss aversion is rooted in fear, but if you constantly hammer on that fear, you risk creating a negative experience for the buyer.
So the key is to balance it out, right? Acknowledge and address those fears directly, but also highlight the positive aspects of the property and the entire home buying process.
Exactly. You can remind them of the joy of finding the perfect home, the potential for building equity, and the long-term benefits of owning a home.
And of course, never ever be manipulative.
Preach. Transparency and honesty are key. You want to earn their trust and guide them to make informed decisions, not pressure them into something they'll regret later.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about what loss aversion is, how it shows up in real estate, and how to use it ethically and effectively.
It's important to remember this is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot more to understand about buyer psychology and decision-making.
So where do we go from here? What are some other aspects we should be thinking about?
One thing that really stood out to me from this podcast was this idea of using loss aversion proactively to help buyers feel more confident and secure in their decisions. But how do we actually do that without creating undue pressure?
Ooh, that's a great question. And it's one that we'll be exploring in the next part of this deep dive. Stay with us because we're just getting started.
I'm hooked. Can't wait to hear what else they have to say. It's a tough one, right? How do we use this knowledge to help buyers without like taking advantage of their fears?
It's like finding that sweet spot between, being informative and being manipulative.
Transparency and honesty. I think
Yeah.
those are key.
Definitely. The podcast really hammers that point home.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying, hey, loss aversion is a real thing, but don't be a jerk about it.
Yeah, for sure. It's about using that knowledge responsibly. Like almost like you're giving buyers a heads up. Hey, these are some of the things your brain might be doing without you realizing it.
Right. It's about empowering them to make smarter decisions,
Yeah.
not tricking them into doing something they'll regret later.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we actually use this knowledge to help people?
Well, one of the big takeaways from the podcast is that education is key. The more buyers understand about the process and the market, the less likely they are to be swayed by those fear-based impulses.
Makes sense. The more you know, the less you have to fear, right?
It's like if you're walking into a dark room, you're going to be a lot more nervous than if you have a flashlight.
Totally. So as an agent, part of your job is to be that flashlight for your clients.
Exactly. To illuminate those potential pitfalls and help them navigate the process with more confidence.
Okay, so education is key. What else?
Well, the podcast also talks about the importance of addressing those loss aversion fears directly.
So like Not trying to downplay them or pretend they don't exist.
Right. Instead of dancing around the issue, you just come right out and acknowledge those fears. Validate them. Let the buyer know that it's totally normal to feel that way.
Okay, but then what? How do you actually help them move past those fears?
Well, the podcast gives this great example. Let's say a buyer is worried about overpaying. A good agent might say something like, I totally understand your concern about overpaying. This is a huge investment and you want to make sure you're getting the best value. That's why we'll carefully analyze the market data, look at comparable properties, and make sure we're making a competitive offer that works for you.
I love how that response validates their concern and then offers a clear plan for addressing it. It's reassuring without being dismissive.
Exactly. It's about meeting those fears with understanding and empathy, not just trying to brush them aside.
Okay, so we've talked about how agents can use this knowledge to support their clients. But what about buyers themselves? How can understanding their own tendencies with loss aversion help them navigate this process?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And the podcast actually touches on this. They say one of the best things buyers can do is to be aware of their own emotional triggers. Like what specifically sets off those fears and anxieties?
So like if you know you're someone who gets really caught up in that FOMO, that fear of missing out, you can take steps to protect yourself from making impulsive decisions.
Exactly. Maybe you set some really clear criteria for your home search, and then you stick to those criteria no matter what.
So you don't get swept up in the craziness of a bidding war and end up with a house that doesn't actually meet your needs.
Right. Or maybe you remind yourself that there will always be other houses, other opportunities. It's not now or never.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Any other tips for buyers?
Well, the podcast also talks about the importance of focusing on the long game. Home buying is a long-term investment, and it's easy to get caught up in the short-term anxieties of the process.
Like, am I getting the absolute best deal, or what if I miss out on this one perfect house?
Right. But if you can shift your focus to the bigger picture, to the long-term benefits of homeownership, it can really help to put those short-term anxieties in perspective.
So like reminding yourself that you're buying a home to live in, to build a life in, not just to win at real estate.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can make a huge difference in how you approach the whole process.
I love that. It's about finding that balance between, the practical and the emotional.
And it seems like that balance is going to be different for everyone. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. Some people are going to be naturally more risk-averse. Others might be more comfortable jumping into a bidding war.
And the key is to understand where you fall on that spectrum, and then to work with an agent who respects your individual needs and boundaries.
It's about finding that right fit, both in terms of the house and the person who's helping you find it.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how understanding loss aversion can help both buyers and agents navigate this wild world of real estate. Is there anything else we should be considering?
One thing that stood out to me is that the podcast didn't really address risk tolerance. We all have different levels of comfort with risk, and that can really impact our decisions, especially when it comes to something as big as buying a home.
That's a great point. Someone with a high risk tolerance might be totally fine with jumping into a competitive bidding war, while someone with a low risk tolerance might prefer to wait for a less intense market.
Exactly. And it's important for both buyers and agents to be aware of those individual differences.
Because what feels like an exciting opportunity to one person might feel like a terrifying gamble to someone else.
Right. So acknowledging those differences can really help everyone approach the process with more empathy and understanding.
So to sum up, we've learned that loss aversion is a powerful force, but it doesn't have to be a negative force in real estate. By understanding how it works, we can use it to make smarter, more informed decisions.
And that awareness can lead to better experiences for both buyers and the agents, creating a more transparent and balanced real estate landscape.
Before we wrap up, what are some other psychological factors that come into play in real estate?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, we could do a whole series on this. But just to give you a taste, we'll be looking at how things like anchoring bias, social proof, and even the way information is presented can influence buyer behavior.
Ooh, anchoring bias. That sounds fascinating.
It is. It's basically our tendency to get fixated on the first piece of information we see, even if it's not accurate or relevant.
So like if you see a house listed at a certain price, that number becomes your anchor. And it colors how you see the value of every other house you look at.
Bingo. And it can be really hard to shake that initial impression, even if you know logically that the price might be too high.
That's a little scary when you think about it.
Yeah.
That initial anchor could totally warp your sense of what's a fair price to pay.
It's definitely something to be aware of both as a buyer and a seller.
Okay, so anchoring bias is a big one. What about social proof?
Social proof is this idea that we're more likely to do something if we see other people doing it, especially when we're not sure what to do ourselves.
So like if you see a bunch of people bidding on a certain house, you're more likely to assume it must be a good deal, even if you haven't really looked into it yourself.
Exactly. It's like that herd mentality. We
Yeah.
follow the crowd even if we don't know where they're going.
And of course, this is something that real estate agents use a lot, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They might casually mention how many other people are interested in a property or how quickly homes in a certain neighborhood are selling.
They're using social proof to create that sense of urgency, to make you feel like you need to act fast before you miss out.
Right, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But again, it's something to be aware of as a buyer. Don't let that social pressure cloud your judgment.
Okay, so we've got anchoring bias, social proof. What was the other one?
Framing. Framing is how information is presented,
Yeah.
and it can have a huge impact on how we perceive things.
So like the same fact can sound very different depending on the wording or the context.
Exactly. For instance, an agent might say, this home has been on the market for a while, which might make it sound less desirable. But they could also say, this is a rare opportunity to snag a great home in a prime location before the price goes up.
Ooh, sneaky.
It's all about the spin. And buyers need to be aware of this because how information is presented can really influence their decisions.
Wow, so we've got anchoring bias, social proof, and framing. These are powerful forces shaping our choices without us even realizing it.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the psychology of real estate. There's so much more to explore.
Well, I, for one, am fascinated by all of this. It really makes you realize how much our brains are working, even when we think we're being totally logical.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about these subconscious processes, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of buying or selling a home.
I think that's a great takeaway. So what's the one piece of advice you would give to someone who's about to jump into the real estate world armed with all of this new psychological insight?
Be mindful. Be aware of your own biases, what triggers your emotions, and how information can be used to sway your decisions. Don't be afraid to question assumptions. Do your own research and trust your gut.
And maybe find an agent who's, down to geek out about behavioral economics with you.
Yes, that's a good one.
Well, that's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us. As always, stay curious out there. All right, so we're back, and I'm like still reeling from all this real estate psychology stuff.
It's pretty wild, huh? Like, it makes you realize how much is going on beneath the surface, you know?
Definitely. And we've uncovered some pretty powerful forces already, loss aversion, framing. But you mentioned some other biggies too, like anchoring bias and social proof. What are those all about?
Okay, so anchoring bias. That's our tendency to latch onto the first piece of information we see, even if it's, like, not the most accurate.
So like if the first house I see is listed at a certain price, I'm going to like judge every other house based on that price, even if it was, I don't know, totally inflated.
Exactly. That first number becomes your anchor, and it can really distort your perception of value.
That's kind of scary. Like what if that first house was a total lemon? And then I'm like comparing everything else to that.
It can happen. That's why it's so important to, like, do your research, look at comparable properties, and not just rely on that initial anchor.
Okay, so anchoring bias, check. What about social proof? I feel like I hear that term everywhere these days.
Social proof is basically the idea that, we're more likely to do something if we see other people doing it.
Like if all my friends are buying houses in a certain neighborhood, I'm going to think, oh, that must be the cool place to live, even if I haven't, like, really considered it myself.
Right. It's that feeling of, well, if everyone else is doing it, it must be the right thing to do.
Which, of course, isn't always true.
Nope. But it's a powerful psychological force for sure.
So how does this play out in real estate?
Well, real estate agents use social proof all the time. They might mention how many other offers they've gotten on a property or how quickly homes in that area are selling.
So they're using that herd mentality to create a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
To make you feel like you need to, like, jump in before it's too late.
Exactly. It can be an effective strategy, but again, buyers need to be aware of it. Don't let yourself get swept up in the frenzy.
So we've got anchoring bias, social proof, and I know you mentioned framing too. What's that all about?
Framing is how information is presented, and it can totally change how we perceive things.
So like the same fact can sound completely different depending on how you say it.
Right. Like an agent might say, this home has been on the market for a while, which makes it sound kind of, I don't know, stale. But they could also say, this is a rare opportunity to get into this sought-after neighborhood before prices go up.
Ooh, that's sneaky. Same information, totally different vibe.
Totally. And it works.
Yeah.
Buyers need to be aware of this because framing can have a huge impact on their decisions.
Okay, so anchoring bias, social proof, framing, it's like we're uncovering all these secret weapons that are being used against us.
Not necessarily against you. It's just important to be aware of these forces so you can make more informed decisions.
Right. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Exactly. And in real estate, that knowledge can save you a lot of stress, heartache, and even money.
So if you could give one piece of advice to anyone who's about to, dive into the real estate market, armed with all of this new psychological insight, what would it be?
Be mindful. Be aware of your own biases, what triggers your emotions, and how information is being presented to you. Don't be afraid to question assumptions and do your own research.
And find an agent who, gets it,
Mhm.
who understands all this stuff and can guide you through the process without, playing mind games.
Totally. It's about finding someone you trust who can help you make the best decision for you.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up.
Yeah.
This has been like a total mind-blowing deep dive into the world of real estate psychology.
It's been fun geeking out with you.
Same here. And hopefully everyone listening has learned a thing or two about how their brains work and how that can affect their real estate decisions.
Maybe it'll even help them land their dream home.
Fingers crossed. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And as always, stay curious out there.